I'm Angela Kennecke, and welcome to the latest episode of Grieving Out Loud. My guest today has had so much life experience when it comes to both suffering and loss. At 11 years old, Ashley Bernardi's father died.
I went and gave him a kiss and said, "I love you, Dad." And he said, "I love you too, honey." And those were the last words that we ever said to each other.
Ashley is a publicist, but realized she had her own story to tell that could help others.
I was running from something I didn't want to face.
In our conversation, you'll see how Ashley transformed her pain and trauma into healing and living her authentic power, which is the title of her new book.
Well, Ashley, I am so excited to meet you and to talk to you today about some of your life experiences and how you use those to put together your book and to help others. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much, Angela. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today to have this important conversation.
Let's just dive right into some of the things that you have faced in your life. And I was looking a little bit at your website and I see a chronic disease, Lyme disease, grief and loss of your dad, and then also postpartum depression. I mean, that's a lot for one person to go through all of those things.
Yeah, it was a lot. And it happened in a very short amount of time. Like all of that happened within 32 years. And like actually specifically, my father passed away when I was 11. So it really all happened in like 21 years, which is even shorter. So it's in some ways, I feel like I've lived a lot of life in a very short amount of time, but the heal me is like so grateful for having moved through a lot of this and processed what I've gone through now so I can talk about it with people like you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to share. And let's start off with what happened with your dad. And it just sounds, I'm so sorry. My stepson lost his mother just before he turned 5. So I understand a little bit about what a child goes through, but not completely because I haven't been through the death of a parent. What happened?
Yeah, so I'll say this first. We've come a long way since my father died in 1995 to actually helping support children who are grieving, but there is absolutely still more work that needs to be done. And my father was an Army colonel. We had I was born in Schweinfurt, Germany. We lived in California. He ended up getting stationed in DC at the Pentagon. Very happy family growing up. Great parental unit. I had a little sister too. And one night we were at home watching a family movie, and my father was tired that evening, and we were all getting ready for bed, and he actually put himself to bed that night. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go tuck Dad in. And I went and gave him a kiss and said, "I love you, Dad." And he said, "I love you too, honey." And those were the last words that we ever said to each other. And just moments later, he started, what we learned was suffering from an active heart attack. And my mom and my sister, my 9-year-old sister, administered CPR on him while I ran to call 911, and then after I called 911, I ran out to get the neighbors just to look for help. So, and this was all, 9 o'clock at night, and it was horrific. It was traumatic. It was, watching your father die in front of you is just a memory that I will remember this experience forever. And I will also say that it took me like 25 years to be able to even talk about it, because after he passed away, it was too hard for me to even come to terms with the fact that I had lost my best friend, and in the way that I did too. And being an Army daughter, we are, and a military kid, we are raised to be strong and stoic like my father, who was a decorated war veteran. And I felt the need to put on that mask of strength for myself, for my family, and get back to normal. And at the advice of grief counselors back in the 90s, they had told my mother that, put her back to school a week later, like, let's get her back to normal. That, in my opinion, was the absolute wrong thing for me to have done. I felt like a misfit and an outcast the moment that I went back to school. Nothing was normal for me. Nothing is still normal. And I spent 20 plus years of my life just burying that trauma and that grief and not addressing it. So that's the story of my loss and grief for my father. And I'm sure we'll get into where I am at now, but I did spend a lot of years just not addressing what happened to me.
So you were not encouraged at that time when you were 11, 12, 13 for to talk about it.
I will say I had support from some incredible grief therapists. I, as an 11 and 12-year-old, and that's a really tough time headed into middle school. In general, I didn't want to talk about it. It was way too hard for me. It was like I was just, if I talked about that, trying to save his life, what I discovered was that I felt a lot of shame around the fact that I perhaps didn't do enough to save his life. And I lived with that guilt that maybe it's my fault. And that was way too hard to talk about. It was way too heavy to be weighing on my chest. But no, I just, it's not like I didn't get the help. I think my mom got some bad advice, like send her back to school. Mm-hmm. I did get put in therapy. As a person, I was just not ready to talk about it.
Well, a couple things come to mind. First, the fact that your last words to your dad were, I love you. You exchanged I love yous. And I have that with my daughter who I lost too. So I try to take comfort in that yes, I do. At least it wasn't some angry exchange or something else. But I do understand that survivor's guilt because we were working on an intervention and we were 3 days too late, and so I just think I should have done it sooner. I wish I would have done more. And so, of course, as a child, you don't even have the wherewithal to understand your own limitations, right? Or your own capabilities, in terms of saving your dad.
Right. It is so true. Survivor's guilt is a real thing. I didn't know that it was at the time, but it was just too painful and too hard for me to address. I wouldn't talk about it with my sister, my mom. I wouldn't visit his gravesite. And my mom and sister, they grieve differently. And I think we all grieve differently. For me, I also felt a guilt that I should have been the one giving CPR. Why was my 9-year-old sister giving CPR? She should have, but in those moments of trauma that when every second counts, there's nothing I could have done. I've learned, now, but we have dealt with it very differently. And so, my mom and sister would visit his gravesite. I never used to want to visit his gravesite. It was way too hard for me. And now where I'm at in a very different place, I see it as a beautiful thing that I can have a relationship with him even in death. But that took me a very long time to get there. And it wasn't until my health crisis hit me over the head did I actually give myself permission to start grieving for my father. It came up pretty naturally because I feel like it was my body saying, no more, you can't hold anything else in anymore. It's all coming out and it's going to come out in a physical way first. And then you're going to make space to actually feel it.
That makes sense to me because I always think about that mind-body connection and how our bodies will tell us even when our minds won't allow it. Right. Yes. And so how old were you when you contracted Lyme disease?
So I will say this, I went living my life very inauthentically for the next 20 years because what happens when you bury grief, I wore a mask of strength and made it look like I was okay everywhere. I became, in high school, secretary of my class, captain of my dance team, but really inside I was dying. I was so lonely. I had a destructive relationship. And because I was lonely and suppressing my feelings, I had destructive relationships later on in life, addiction to work, a destructive relationship with alcohol. I was dishonest to myself and others. I had horrible lack of boundaries, was a people pleaser. Just, it all came out in other ways. So it wasn't until I was in my early 30s when this mystery illness hit me over my head. I had just delivered my third baby. And I was suddenly just over the minute she came out, the minute she was born. And I believe I contracted Lyme disease before she was born, but when you get pregnant, your immune system goes quiet and suppresses any symptoms. So the moment that she came out, it was like I was losing my vision. I couldn't see. I had flashing lights in my eyes. My entire body went numb. I had horrible pain in my head and my whole body. And it was like I had the flu every single day, but it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And to the point where I was bedridden. And my husband didn't know what to do with me. It was very scary. We had 3 little kids at home, all under age 5. And so he would send them to my in-laws' house. And I would just either lay in bed, bedridden, or go try to see the next doctor and the next doctor and the next doctor who, and this is like a whole completely other story, just like completely diminished my feelings and my symptoms, told me I had, oh, maybe it's chronic fatigue, maybe it's fibromyalgia. They just couldn't figure out what to do with me. So they tried to give a label on it that I know was not right. I said, no, there's actually something very wrong. So at the same time, while, we're trying to figure out this diagnosis, I was diagnosed with postpartum depression. And that was comforting for me because it felt like, well, at least I can get one diagnosis. And I was put in a part-time mental health hospitalization program, which means that I was in a mental health facility 8 hours a day, and I got to go home and sleep. And then I would wake up in the morning and go back. And I did that for several weeks to learn coping skills for depression, anxiety. I was having panic attacks. All of these symptoms, I believe, were brought on by the Lyme disease, but also the bearing of the grief and trauma over the years. It kind of all just became this perfect storm. And really, it was when, I'll never forget, there was one day that I was getting my blood drawn at a doctor's office. And I hadn't been diagnosed with Lyme disease yet. They were just drawing some blood, and I started blacking out. Like, I lost my vision. I lost complete control of my bowels, which is like even embarrassing to admit. The doctor's office called 911, went into the hospital in an ambulance, continuing to pee out of in a bucket. And I went home with no answers. And my mom thought I was going to die that day. I thought that was it too. And I'll never forget getting up out of bed and just like falling on the floor and surrendering and being like, that's it, God. And that's when it became a spiritual experience, was when I just surrendered to everything. And I was like, okay, I can no longer control this. I surrendered to you, God. And in that moment, I started just grieving for my health. And as I found that I was like crying and sobbing and grieving for my health, I suddenly really missed my dad. And so then I started crying and sobbing and grieving for my dad. And it all, as soon as those floodgates opened, it was like oh my gosh, aha experience of, oh, this is maybe what I needed. And that was the start of my healing journey. So like a couple weeks later, there was another doctor, and there's no exaggeration when I tell you I had seen 30 doctors up until that point, who gave me the correct diagnosis, told me that I was so far gone. Like, I had encephalitis in my brain. I was completely just gone, gone. Like, I felt like I was going to die. And my husband could tell you, he thought that too. And she said, okay, you are so far gone. Oral antibiotics aren't going to work for you. We're going to give you an IV PICC line to your heart and give you IV antibiotics. So I had that for 8 weeks, and it was such a slow, excruciating journey. And I did not get fully better in those 8 weeks. My process of physical healing took about a year, but it's because I worked on my spiritual self and processing my trauma at the same time. So I do come to you today fully healed, vibrant, alive, and able to process my feelings in healthy and safe ways. But it took a very long time to get to that point.
Wow. Well, I am so sorry for everything you've been through. I think about all the suffering, all the physical suffering. I do think that our bodies have an interesting way of stopping us in our tracks when they need to. But your suffering was extreme. I have some minor thing. I lost my voice at the end of January, and my voice is my life. Right?
That's how
and
you
it's
work.
still, it is still a little raspy. And I mean, that's minor compared to what you've been through. And I was so frustrated. It's still a little raspy. And I'm so frustrated by my body's inability to heal itself. I just have an injured vocal cord, like a weak vocal cord. But I can't imagine how you felt. And then you have these 3 children, a baby, and the guilt you must have felt. You couldn't be there for them when you are extremely ill.
Yeah.
And the burden's falling on your husband and other people. I mean, the psychological toll that must have taken on you, not to mention all this grief coming back up from your childhood. Wow.
Yeah. Yes, you're absolutely right. And that's where surrendering to it just all happened. It was like, I had always my entire life, because of the trauma I experienced of losing my father, tried to be in control of everything. Because if Ashley was in control of everything, nothing bad would happen, right? Like, but that's just wrong. So I became this like type A control freak that wanted absolute control of everything. But when I couldn't take care of my kids, we had to call my in-laws and say, hey, can we move in? Because when I had a pick line, I couldn't even lift babies. My husband still had to go to work. And so we had to move in with them. So it was truly an act of, for the first time in my life, surrendering my life over to loved ones who were ready to care for me and my family, and surrendering my pain and suffering over to my higher power, over to God, over to the divine. It could be whatever you call it to be, but that's truly what it was for me. And just to also surrender, but then trust. And that's a really hard thing to do in those moments of complete despair and confusion. And why am I missing my dad 25 years later? But I had to trust that these feelings were here for a reason. And I learned that when I got quiet and still for the first time in over 20 years, because I spent 20 something years being that busy person who could never sit down and acknowledge and be still and acknowledge what was going on inside me. But when I started to do that, when I started to get quiet and still, I heard that inner voice inside me say, you know what, Ashley, you're missing your dad today. And that's okay. What can you do to honor this, honor his memory? And that opened up the door to find creative ways to remember him and still have a relationship with him, even in death. And it's just such a beautiful way. It's a better way for me to live, at least today, than I did for most of my life.
Well, I'm smiling and nodding because I am a type A personality overachiever who could never sit down. And life really has slowed me down quite a bit, especially with the death of my daughter. I had to take time to grieve. I had to take time to take a different course to figure out what I was going to do with this horrific loss. But I think there's a lot of us out there, a lot of women, maybe especially overachievers, strivers, type A, however you want to talk about it. And sometimes maybe we are running from things we don't want to face.
You nailed it, Angela. That's exactly it. I was running from something I didn't want to face because it was way too hard. And what was easier was to put on that mask of strength, be stoic, act like everything's okay. But really on the inside, I was suffering. I was so lonely. I would never, and I'll also say this, which I think is interesting from a perspective of a child who's experienced grief, is I never told anyone in like growing up after my dad died that he died. Like friends would come over. I had a boyfriend come over. I didn't tell him that my dad passed away. Everyone just assumed Ashley's dad was not home or somewhere. It was that hard for me to even tell people that my dad passed away. But now I've learned that by talking about it, I can connect with people like you and have deeper, more beautiful conversations and relationships by getting vulnerable and honest with my truth and also with my feelings too. And I've learned that even 20 years later, it's okay to still grieve for someone that you've lost that long ago. Like, I'll just give you an example. I ran the Army 10 miler this past year in honor of my father. First time I've ever done it. And I was like, I'm doing it for dad, because my whole thing now is like, I want to have a creative relationship with my dad, even in death. And afterwards, I ran to his gravesite by myself. I went to visit him and I was like, I had a conversation with him. I was like, I did it, Dad. And I talked to him and I just let myself cry and just grieve for him all over again. Because I've learned that like grief is a dance and those feelings can come up. Sometimes it feels like it was yesterday that I lost him, and that's okay. Other times it feels like it was over 25 years that I lost him. But in those moments that I feel it, I now give myself permission to move through it in a safe and healthy way, so I can process those feelings and energetically move them through my body.
I actually wrote a blog called The Dance Between Grief and Joy, because really it is a dance and grief keeps popping back up. But yet somehow as time goes by, you find yourself smiling again or laughing again or enjoying life. But then that grief comes back in when you least expect it oftentimes. I think, though, that approaching life with an open heart, with vulnerability, being authentic, it's really hard to do at first. At least that's what I found. And I'm in the public eye. So people see this, news reporter who doesn't show a lot of emotion on TV, right? But when I started writing my blogs and doing this podcast, I realized I needed to be authentic for all of the other people out there going through the same kinds of things. And I think that's the way we take our trauma and our suffering and give back to the world, right? And you did that through a book.
And I also think for you, perhaps that it was a way for you to continue to heal by talking about it, because my book was so healing to write. And that was first and foremost, like selfishly, the first time I ever wrote about the loss of my father was in this book. It was so hard to do, but it was so healing for me to do as well. And something else I'll say is that it is so hard to be vulnerable. I do think in society, we are expected to show up on Instagram, on social media, and really show our best selves and market our best selves, when really we might not be feeling that way. And I remember going through my health crisis and starting to do the same thing that I did after I lost my father. Didn't talk about it. I was running a small business at the time. Clients didn't know, colleagues didn't know, and I was starting to bury it again. And then I felt called, like once I had my spiritual calling and awakening, I felt called to start sharing it with my trusted circle. So I reached out to a group of friends from high school that I'm still very close with. And I said, you guys, you don't know this, but here's what's happening to me. I've got this crazy undiagnosed illness. I've been in bed. I'm typing from my bed. I've been in a mental health facility. Like no one knew. And I was met with so much love, just so much love. And they gave me permission to feel safe to share that. And so by doing that, my support system helped me heal as well. And so I started telling a little bit more and a little bit more. And then eventually I had a community of people loving me and supporting me, because I, for the first time in my life, got vulnerable about what was really happening to me.
I think also, Brene Brown talks a lot about vulnerability, obviously, and you have to know who you can be vulnerable with. Although when you put a book out there or a blog out there, you're sort of vulnerable with the whole world. But I think going to your trusted friends to start was a smart move.
Yeah, it was what I was called to do. I mean, obviously my husband knew what was going on, and my mom and my sister and my in-laws. But I think there was a part of me that felt called to reach out to my high school friends, because I almost was lying to them all of high school about how I was really feeling. And they still stood by my side, and they were still my friends. And they've been so supportive of this book and beyond. But it was almost like I needed to tell them first, because that was where my story started after my dad died. And I went into middle school and high school just acting like everything was okay, but really I was suffering, and what I was experiencing 20 plus years later was a product of that suffering from all those years previously.
Yeah, I don't think we want to think that way. I think we're trained to think things are, just lineal. We just go in one direction, and the things that happened in the past don't matter anymore.
Yeah.
And people don't always want to. It's very hard. Like, you suppressed all this. So, but even if you're suppressing something, even if you realize that there's something else there, it still can be really hard to confront it.
It is so hard to confront it. Absolutely. It's uncomfortable. I'm reading Martha Beck's book right now, The Way of Integrity, which I love. And she talks about Dante's Inferno and about how it's about going into the fire. And sometimes to address those uncomfortable emotions and feelings, it feels so scary. And you're like, I'm not ready to do that yet. And I will say this, that's okay. That's where you get professional help. Like, this is professional help for me. I didn't utilize it in the way that I should have back then, because I didn't know how. But now that I do, I have professional help once a week by a therapist who I feel safe to share these types of feelings with. And so first and foremost, know that there are options out there for you, for anyone who is scared to feel those feelings, to go into that inferno, that there are safe ways to do that don't involve numbing yourself out, alcohol, work addiction, all the things, destructive relationships, which is what I used to do. And that doesn't work.
And what millions of people do that all the time. I think it's amazing how far you've come from this debilitating disease, and to write this book in the middle of a pandemic when many people with mental health issues really struggled. Was it therapeutic for you to write the book during that time?
Yes, I love this question. During the pandemic, and this is why I wrote the book, in the early days of the pandemic, March 2020, April 2020, I had this aha moment again because I started feeling the same feelings I felt when my dad died, right? I had experienced grief. I lost a friend early in the days of COVID. I was grieving for the loss of my children's education. They were all home, and what were we going to do with them? It was the stress, it was the despair, it was the shame, it was the confusion, all these feelings, the same feelings. And I was like, oh, wait a second. I know what to do now. I'm not bearing these feelings this time around. I am going to create safe environment for me to process them. And the way that I process them, and I write a lot about that in my book, but is through what I call sacred writing and journaling and breath work and meditation and yoga. There's a whole bunch of things that I've learned to do myself that work for me. And I felt called to write about it because I was like, I am never going back to how I dealt with my first trauma. And what I saw happen in March of 2020 was a collective trauma. I was like, we're all going through a trauma. We're all grieving right now. All of us, everyone in the world. And that's where I felt called to share my story for the first time ever. And just as an antidote to remind people that these uncomfortable, awful feelings, while they are there, they're important and there can be lessons in them, and they're also temporary. And that's one of the things that scared me from going into that inferno as a child, was that I felt that if I did go into that grief, that I was never going to get out of it, that it was going to be a place where I would enter and live forever. And what I've learned is that that is just not true. Grief is here for a reason. In the same way that we experience joy and elation, it's here for us to move through and process and teach us something. There's lessons in grief, and there's even love in grief too.
I agree 100%. I have to sometimes tell myself when those waves of grief come over me to not try to escape from that, to some anxiety may kick in, right? And I have to tell myself, I'm going to have to mentally tell myself, it's okay to be sad right now. It's okay to cry, and it will pass if you allow it to move through you. Otherwise, it gets stuck the way it got stuck in you.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I mean, that's the subtitle of my book. Giving yourself permission to feel. So just that affirmation, like, it is okay to feel this right now. And another affirmation that I have in my book is, this is temporary. That one really helped me when I was in the throes of Lyme disease and postpartum depression, is that this moment, okay, it sucks. We're not going to acknowledge that it doesn't suck, but it's temporary. And what can I do to help support myself in a gentle, loving way to move through this? And it can look different for everyone. When I was in the thick of Lyme disease, I took a coping sheet. So I got a white piece of paper, I got my kids' markers, and I put Ashley's coping sheet on it. So when I was in those like really tough days, I stuck this sheet on my refrigerator as a reminder that I can do things to help support myself in these tough moments. And it could be very simple things. For me, it was like, light a candle, listen to classical music, take a bath, step outside and put your toes in the grass. Just as that, because sometimes we need that visual reminder to start creating those habits of self-care and well-being. And that I had on my refrigerator for over a year. I actually have it over somewhere here now. I'm never going to get rid of it, because it's always going to be that reminder to me that in these moments, there are always moments that stink, but you can do things to help support yourself in a gentle and loving way.
Yeah, I think so often we aren't very kind to ourselves. We beat ourselves up, and we
Yeah.
think, why can't I control this? It comes down to that issue of control oftentimes when things and people are really out of our control. So what do you hope that your reader takes away? Is there some advice that you'd have for people who are dealing right now with maybe depression and grief or
Oh
illness?
yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I'll say is, read the book. I have a whole chapter about, moving through, it's called Getting Primal with Your Meltdown. So actually, this is one piece of advice that I'd love to share. So in my book, I've also interviewed over 20 healing experts ranging from psychologists, psychiatrists, ER doctors, you name it. One doctor that I interviewed is Dr. Jamie Hope, and she is a trauma physician in a Detroit hospital, level 1 trauma center, one of the busiest trauma centers in the country. So we were talking about the importance of getting primal with your emotions. And what she means by that is that we are built, right? So as an example, we're built to release our emotions in sometimes a physical and safe way. So like as children, when something's wrong with us, we cry. Yet we tell our children to stop crying if they're crying, right? And so I've learned that over the years that if my kids are crying, I'm like, okay, something's upsetting you. Like, let's sit down and talk about it rather than quit it, grow up, stop crying, you know. But anyway, so Dr. Hope says that it's important to release your emotions in a way that's safe. And if you want to do so in a primal way, like we did like back in the caveman days, that's okay. So she recommends something called dish therapy. I don't know if you've ever heard of dish therapy. So it's where you get a bunch of old dishes. And if you don't have any, you could like pick some up out of Salvation Army. You get a trash can, you put some safety goggles on, you alert your neighbors what you're about to do, and you smash the dishes into the trash can. I have not done it, but I have a set of dishes over here that I'm like just waiting for that day for me to feel like doing it. But Dr. Hope says it is the most satisfying thing you will ever do. And it's just a great way to energetically release those emotions. You're probably, I mean, I'm starting to see smash rooms show up. I'm in the DC area. So we have like smash rooms where you can go and get bats and just like smash things. And it's just like a great way to get out that anger and sadness and frustration. She also recommends something called a Damn It doll, where you can like get a Damn It doll on Amazon. And if you feel like whacking your wall or whacking your bed, you can do that. But even like the act of screaming. And I'll say like during the pandemic, I went through a breathwork course. And at the end of the course, the instructor invited us to scream. For the first time in years, I let out a primal scream, and it was the most satisfying scream. And I felt like I was walking on clouds for the rest of the week. I didn't realize how much I just needed to get that scream out. So for anyone listening, I would say like, get curious about some safe ways that you can support yourself releasing your emotions in a primal way. And I have all about that in my book. Dr. Hope recommends a hard toolkit, a stress hard toolkit and a stress soft toolkit, and just to have them at the ready when you're feeling those primal emotions come up. Stress soft could look like something like maybe it's breath work, maybe it's meditation, maybe it's yoga, whereas stressing hard is like, I'm going to scream, I'm going to hit a pillow, I'm going to do dish therapy. So that's one piece of advice, is to find ways to release your emotions in a safe and loving way that is supportive to you.
Well, we are definitely going to put a link to get your book on the show notes of this podcast too, and on our website, so people will know how to do that. You know, I think I kind of do all those things. I actually had a friend give me a plate after Emily died, a really close friend, and said, when you're feeling angry, this is for you to break. And I actually didn't break it until more recently. I was just, the senselessness of her death was just eating me up. Like, this didn't have to happen. This is just so dumb. This should have never happened. And I felt so angry about it, but it took me like 4 years, maybe because a close friend gave it to me. I was like, I can't, this kind of has sentimental value.
Nice dish, yeah.
But I would say that also screaming in your car works pretty well too. Sometimes when those waves of grief, they hit you like kind of when you're all alone. Sometimes the car is a safe place to scream. The people next to you might think you're crazy, but you know, if you're at a stoplight or something, but it's pretty safe to scream in a car. You're not going to.
It's a great place in a car, at home. Like, I would say, I mean, even during the pandemic, there were places that like a bunch of moms would go to a football field and scream. And the New York Times had their primal scream line where moms could just call in and start screaming. So it's a thing. I'm starting to see it growing on. And this is like going back to the beginning of the conversation, where I do think that as a society, we've come a long way in how we address and acknowledge grief for people who are dealing with messy emotions, but there's still so much more work to be done. And I'm sure you will agree.
So much more. But I think by having this conversation and you talking openly about, you know, the mental health needs that you, patient facility, maybe not overnight, but I mean, just talking about that, talking about what you went through, I think these conversations are so important, just opening up the dialogue so that people do feel like they can also talk about it. And we reduce the stigma and the shame surrounding these things.
Yeah,
100%.
I mean, that's the work. It's like the more people like us can talk about it, it's exactly it. The more and more people will feel safer to open up as well. And that's really where healing happens.
Right. And we've got a whole generation that looks at things a little bit differently than the last. And the last generation, was raised by very stoic people for the most part. And people didn't talk about things that were considered shameful or embarrassing in the open. And I think that's shifting for the good.
I agree with you. I'm hopeful for my 3 kids that we're raising, that I'm giving them permission to feel and process their emotions. And that feels good to me as a mom.
So you're healthy today. I mean, obviously you still miss your dad. Everything's going well though, for the most part.
So healthy. So this year I ran my first half marathon. I picked up my love for running, which I quit running when my dad died. I used to love running. And then when he died, I stopped. And I picked it up again a couple of years ago, and I'm just like, I'm going. I did my Army 10 miler, my half marathon. Who knows what's next? But I'm coming from, the brink of death to vibrant health. I really take advantage of the gift of a healthy body, and move it as much as possible, get out in nature as much as possible, and, honor the form of the body, because I know what it's like to not have the body working. And so when it's working, I am working for it, and it feels so good to be healthy today.
We oftentimes don't appreciate what we have until we don't have it anymore. And I think that's so true about our health. We just take it for granted until it's challenged.
Yep.
Thank you so much for writing this book and for sharing it with the world. I really appreciate the conversation and just learning a little bit more about you and everything you've been through. And it's great to see how well you're doing today.
Thank you, Angela. I appreciate it. And, hopefully my story will provide inspiration for anyone who might be suffering, whether it's from their own health trauma or grief, and just find some hope and peace in my story. That is why I've wanted to share mine.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because there is hope and you can move through these difficult things, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel oftentimes. So we want to give people that hope.
That's right.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Grieving Out Loud. Connect with us online at emilyshope.foundation. While you're there, check out my blog and other podcast episodes. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider giving us a positive review. Until next time, wishing you faith, hope, and courage.